You'll find take your Bibles and find in Acts chapter 8. I had a fairly prolonged introduction I was going to share, but since Clark went on and on, no, I'm just I don't get to go on and on. So I'm going to share just real quick. Have you ever had a 3-month conversation? I've had a few that felt like it. Our leadership team, in a sense, has had a 3-month conversation way back in May. I brought, and it's a great leadership team. The church here is blessed, but I brought to the team a question. I said, I just want to introduce a question to you, and we will talk about it as we go along. And here was the question: what are we trying to do, really? I said, I don't want answers now. I don't want knee-jerk. I don't want Sunday school answers. I just want us to think as leaders, what are we trying to do, really? So I introduced it. I said, here's some scriptures to consider. Here's some organizations and churches and some stuff that they've come to as far as when they tried to describe what they were really trying to accomplish. So I just want you to think about it. And we will talk about it next month. So the June meeting comes, and we start to take care of the other kinds of business, and then now we need to talk about our question. It was an interesting conversation. We had to get past the whole, okay, is this kind of a deal where Barney has the answer and he's waiting for us to figure it out? And I had to keep telling him, no, this isn't about that I have the answer that I'm trying to steer you toward. I want us as 8 people around a table to have a conversation and come to it together to say, what are we really trying to do? There was a good conversation about ways to, trying to reach people and see people grow and be a place that cares for people, and it was really, really good. I said, we're going to talk it all through, but in July, we need to just pin it down. Make it real clear, make it real simple, something that would fit on a t-shirt. What are we really trying to accomplish? At our July meeting, took care of the other things, and I said, okay, it's time. Let's land the plane. Let's put a bow on this. What do we have? We kind of revisited some things, and one of the exchanges was really interesting, because it came up about, if we bring church to people, maybe that's a way that we could bring people to church. But after it was all done, we had some more conversation. I said, okay, what is it? What do we think, really? And everyone, there was kind of this pause, and everyone looked at me like, okay, are you going to give the answer now? And I didn't. Probably the least vocal member of the leadership team. He sat, and then he kind of put his hands out like this, and he said, make Jesus real. And we all looked at each other. Like, yeah. We thought, do we try to tweak that any? No. What we're really trying to accomplish, if you think about it, is we want to make Jesus real. That was the end of, if you want to say, that conversation, but it triggered some other conversations. Mel had been gone in early July, and then when she came back, she and I sat down. I said, Mel, we need to talk about this, because here's what the leaders of this church have come to as far as what we need to be about and what we're trying to accomplish. And I said, so we have to figure out, what does that mean in worship? What do we do as far as worship that would help make Jesus real for people who come here on a Sunday morning? And that's not where it stopped. I talked to key leaders with the midweek and said, this is what our leaders have come to. We have to start talking and start figuring out, how do we make Jesus real to kids that come here on Wednesday nights? I put things in place to start a small group for the summer with our youth leaders to kind of get this whole, we're focusing on the heart. And really, before we got too far on that, the first time we got together, I said, here's something we have to figure out. We need to start framing things in this way. How do we make Jesus real to middle school kids and high school kids, that this is the only point of contact with the church that they have? How do we do that? And we need to come at it with that basic 3-word frame in our mind. How do we make Jesus real? And then, as I was pondering, all these things were bouncing around. I said, I need to do messages about this. The church as a whole. We need to start asking and aggressively answering the question, how do we make Jesus real? And I started to think about that, and I thought, where would I go? Where would I look to in the scripture as far as about making Jesus real? And it didn't take me very long. I was drawn to the book of Acts because it's all over the place. Book of Acts, you see Jesus being made real in all sorts of ways at every turn. And sometimes it's by names that we recognize, Peter and Paul, James and John, and a lot of times it's by people whose names we don't recognize at all. I think the current way to say stuff now is mashup. Is that right? Guys, help me. Mashup, that's where you kind of take a variety of different things and kind of put it together. Well, in the book of Acts, you've got this mashup of people, all ages and situations, but where they are, they're making Jesus real. And that's why this whole thing spread. That's why the whole thing moved forward. That's why we are here now, is because of people making Jesus real in Acts. You follow me? So here's a lesser known name that's making Jesus real. And this encourages me, because most of us aren't the glorious leader. Most of us are your rank and file kind of guys, and men and women. And that's what you see in the book of Acts. So many of these folks, they're just everyday people. And yet God's kingdom grows and moves and spreads through them. You know why? Because they make Jesus real. Here's an episode in Acts chapter 8. We're going to start at verse 26. I'm going to take it down to about verse 35, maybe 36. How about 36? Okay, let me frame this a little bit now that I'm out of time. In the book of Acts, God pours himself out on people, and things start to happen in the lives of a lot of people. But when things start happening in the lives of a lot of people, what you also find is resistance starts to grow, and that's what happens in the book of Acts. And it really reaches its high point in terms of its intensity in Acts chapter 7, where another kind of rank and file guy, Stephen, gets killed by the powers that be. And that means now it's open season on Christians. And what happens then is that they're scattered, in part for their protection. But you know what happens once they scatter them? People still keep living for Jesus. And so now this church that gets scattered is all over the place, making Jesus real here, and here. So it's spreading. And Philip is one of those. So he's out, and then he's been in Samaria. And then it says in verse 26, an angel of the Lord spoke to him and said, you need to get up and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road. And he arose and went, and there was an Ethiopian eunuch. Eunuch could be reference to a physical condition, but it could, or a procedure, but it could also be that was used sometimes to mean an official in service of a ruler. A court official at Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure, and he came to Jerusalem to worship, and he was returning and sitting in his chariot and was reading the prophet Isaiah. And the Spirit said to Philip, go up and join this chariot. And Philip ran up, and he heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet, and he said, do you understand what you're reading? And the man says, well, how could I unless someone guides me? So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now the passage of Scripture that he was reading was, he was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he didn't open his mouth. In humiliation his judgment was taken away. Who will relate to this generation? For his life is removed from the earth. And the man asked Philip and said, tell me, of whom does the prophet say this? Is he talking about himself or somebody else? And Philip opened his mouth. Beginning from this scripture, he preached Jesus to him. And as they went along the road, they came to some water, and the man said, look, water, what would prevent me from being baptized? Philip says, if you believe. And then verse 38, the man ordered the chariot to stop. They both went down into the water, and Philip, as well as the eunuch, and he baptized them. I think Jesus became real, right? in this episode. I just want to look at a couple of things, and it's going to have to be very quick in terms of this episode of making Jesus real. And here's the first thing that comes out of the story. This whole thing is triggered. The whole thing is triggered by the whisper of God. The whole thing is triggered by the whisper of God to Philip. No whisper, no episode. It's triggered by God's whisper. It says the angel first, and then it says the Spirit. God himself speaks into Philip. Now, time doesn't allow me here, but let me just touch a little bit here about this, about the voice of God. What we see in Philip here, in terms of God whispering something to him, is that apparently this voice is familiar to Philip. We're told Philip is a man of the Spirit, Acts chapter 2. He's there when everything gets poured out. In Acts chapter 6, everyone else says, yeah, you're a man of the Spirit. We need you to be in some sort of leadership. So he's a man of the Spirit, so somewhere this voice is familiar to him. Second, this voice doesn't originate with him. I don't know if you're like me or not, but I get all sorts of thoughts and ideas that just kind of go bouncing around in my head almost all the time. And sometimes I'm not always sure what's me. But every now and again, there is a thought, there is a word or something that like cuts through everything else, and I realize this didn't come from me. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's like sometimes God speaks into me, and I can have a sense of knowing it because I realize this didn't really originate with me. It wasn't the stuff that I'm usually bouncing around. This kind of came out of nowhere. It resonates with who he knows Jesus is. And the last thing about this whisper is it moves him outside of himself. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that God speaks into us just to drive us deeper into ourselves. When God whispers to Philip, it's to get him out of himself. Did you notice that? It's John Stott, he said, this is the summary of the book of Acts. God sends his Spirit to the church to send the church to the world. He doesn't send the Spirit to the church to drive the church deeper into itself. He sends the Spirit to the church to send the church to the world. So he speaks to Philip, not just to drive Philip deeper into Philip. He speaks into Philip to move Philip outside of himself to somebody else who needs God. This whole thing gets triggered by the voice of God, by the whisper of God to Philip. But it's still going to be a very short story if Philip doesn't respond. Right? So we could read along, and so the Spirit of God says to Philip, but Philip ignored it. End of story. Spirit speaks to Philip, but Philip talks himself out of it. End of story. It unfolds because Philip is willing to respond, and he does a couple of things. He shows himself that he is not unwilling to do what God whispers to him. Two times. I think you check it for me and see. I think it's verse 27 and then verse 30. We blow right past it when we read it, but it says this. The angel said to Philip, I need you to go south, which I would have said, where's south? I don't know what south means. But Philip knows. And all we're told about that is it says, so Philip went. I need you to go here to this desert road. So Philip goes. And then the Spirit says, I need you to go up to the chariot. And it doesn't say Philip argues with it. It just says Philip goes. He shows that he's not unwilling to do what God's whisper directs him to do. And he's not, how do I want to say this? He's not clueless. He's not unwitting, there you go, about what's going on. When he goes up, God's already set the table, right? The guy's already got the book of Isaiah open and reading about a passage that clearly is about Jesus. And so the table's set, and it's like, Philip, you just need to pull up a chair. I've been clueless before. Anyone else been clueless before? I've been clueless a lot. I remember one time, do you have time? This is kind of a funny story. Do you have time for this story? Even if you don't, you're getting it, okay? I was growing up with I'm the youngest of four, brother, two sisters, and for some reason we were playing cards. And we didn't usually play cards because we weren't allowed to play cards. But I guess mom was away or something, but we were playing cards, and we were particularly sinful because we were playing poker. And we were playing poker, the only kind of poker I know, 5-card draw. We were playing 5-card draw, and you know what? I was losing every hand. Part of it because I was the youngest, and so they would kind of make up the rules, and so so I always lost. But somewhere the goodness and the grace of God got poured out into their hearts, and they had mercy on me for losing every time. And so my sister created a reason for me to get up and leave to go probably get her something to drink or go get her a snack or whatever. And then they kept, hey, and do this. And while they were doing it, unbeknownst to me, they were stacking the deck. They were stacking the deck so that I would get a royal flush. And they were stacking the deck in such a way that it wouldn't just be all in my hand, but 4 out of the 5 cards would be in my hand, and they already had it planned out that who would ask for how many cards, and so all I had to do was ask for 1 card. And I would get the royal flush, and I'd win the game. So I come back, and they're all sitting here, and they follow their script, and I just look at my hand, and they said, well, Barney, how many for you? And I said, 3. Didn't have any clue what was going on. Guess what? I didn't win that hand either. God stacks this deck for Philip, but you know what? At least he's aware enough to realize that God's laid the whole thing out for him. And I think the reason he's aware is simply because this. He's not so much asking, what am I doing here? He's asking, what's God doing here? Now, real quick, just think about this. There are times that God whispers into you. But the truth is, we're too busy trying to figure out what am I doing here, that we never ask what God's doing here. And when we don't ask what God's doing here, we're probably going to be like me playing poker. Give me 3. This thing unfolds because of the way Philip responds. And that's the gist of it. But I've got one more thing to say, and this is really important. This episode where Jesus is made real to this guy from Ethiopia, listen, it's all fueled because Philip follows. This whole deal is fueled because Philip follows. Not just in that particular episode. Philip recognizes that the man is reading from Isaiah 53. Why do you think he recognized that? Because he knew it. How do you think he knew it? Because he'd spent 2 years with Jesus at least. And because he had sat under the apostles' teaching for some time, he not only knew it was Isaiah, he knew it was about Jesus. He had owned the things said about Jesus from the scripture. He owned what Jesus had taught. And because he had owned it for himself, then he was able to fuel that exchange because he knew Jesus and he knew what was said about Jesus and he knew what Jesus had taught. That's what fueled this. And you know what else fueled this particular episode? His following of Jesus in terms of doing what Jesus did. Where's that, Barn? I don't know if you pick up on this, but this episode is real similar. It kind of has an echo to something. In this episode, there's the guy from Ethiopia. Given his position, he almost certainly had a driver. So there's 2 of them on their way, dealing with things pertaining to Jesus, but they don't understand. You follow me? That's the story. They are then approached by a stranger who explains the whole thing, and it leads to them participating in a testimony act, being baptized. That's the basic. Does that sound familiar at all? How about Luke 24? On the way to Emmaus, how many people were walking along? What were they talking about? Things pertaining to Jesus, but they didn't understand. Then they get approached by a stranger who unpacks the whole thing for them, and the whole thing starts to come clear. And when he breaks the bread, which is a testimonial act, this is Philip reenacting the very thing Jesus did. We are told in Luke 24, only one of the 2, as far as by name. It was Cleopas. We don't know who the other one is. I'm wondering if it's Philip. Now listen. This episode where Jesus gets made real in the life of this guy from Ethiopia happens. The whole thing is powered by Philip following Jesus. Not just in an instance, but with his life. And now I'm going from preaching to meddling. The impotence of the church in America is because we don't follow. And that's the truth. The impotence, the lack of power in our culture is because the church doesn't follow. Instead, we just like Jesus. But Jesus never comes and says, come like me. He says, come and follow me. I'm going to take another step. The lack of effectiveness of church in this community is because we don't follow him. We just like him. Let me illustrate. Well, I follow Jesus. Okay, do you? Do you forgive? Really? Do you forgive? He says what Jesus did. That's what Jesus said. And if we're a follower, we do what he said, and we do just like he did. That's what he did. Before we hasten to answer, this is a little town with a long memory. There are folks who gather, and they've carried grudges for decades. Do you follow Jesus? You just like him. If you follow him, you forgive. That's what it means. I'll go on, shall I? Oh, I follow Jesus. Do you? Do you serve? Do you serve? He did. He does to this day. Please don't do the Mike and Deb deal. Mike and Deb were in a church that I was at in Elkhart, and they were involved in the church. And then later, when we, years later, we came back to the community, we were visiting with them. And they said, "Oh yeah, we go to this church now. It's a big mega church out in the area." I said, "Really? What do y'all do there?" "We just go." I said, "Are you contributing in it?" No. We feel like we've kind of put in our time. I searched the scriptures. I've never seen Jesus describe a retirement plan for the kingdom. If we say we follow him, do we serve? Oh, I can keep going. Do we give? Jesus taught the tithe 10%. Jesus did more than that. He gave it all, right? Do we follow him? Do we not? Do we just like him? Jesus said, you need to gather together and worship. That's what Jesus did. It said, as was his custom, he would gather. Do we follow him? Or do we just like him? If everything works out right, I guess I'll go. Really? Do we follow him? Philip shares what he shares because he heard that from Jesus. He heard it about Jesus. He knew Jesus. That's how it worked. Philip did what he did because he saw Jesus do it. Philip powers this whole thing in terms of making Jesus real because he followed Jesus. Now here's the clincher, and this is it, and I'll be done. Jesus was made real in the Ethiopian guy's life that day. You know why? Because Jesus had been real in Philip's life. That's the deal. If we want to wave a flag about make Jesus real, that's fine, but just understand we don't make Jesus real out there before he becomes real in here. And I'll leave you with that. Here's 3 words about what we're really trying to do. Make Jesus real.